Hello everyone, this is Recap Movie Club and today I will talk about an interesting movie title in the comments. Enjoy watching it. At the very start of the movie, we are introduced to the main character who is in one of the prison cells. From the very first frames he makes it clear that he is not the smartest guy in the colony, as he has problems with numbers and cannot read. But his cellmate is happy to help him with the counting. The colony staff peeks into the cell with the news that he is being released. The now ex-convict's name was Calvin Sims. Calvin is a diamond specialist robber. Uniquely, Calvin has a miniaturized body like a toddler, allowing him to perform his actions more freely. After getting out of prison, Calvin is picked up by his coworker named Percy. Next, Percy offers Calvin a job, stealing diamonds from a jewelry store. Calvin refuses and berates Percy. He has just been released and doesn't want to be in jail anymore. But Percy manages to convince him for a lucrative fee. Calvin and Percy devise a plan to rob the jewelry store they are targeting. Percy entered the jewelry store carrying a giant bag with Calvin inside. Percy then attempted to distract a store employee while Calvin crept up to the diamond display case. Calvin managed to sneak to the bottom, open the display case, and take out the diamond. But just as he was about to leave, a small problem appears. Some lady's dog jumped into the bag. She immediately raised the alarm. Percy started to run off. When they got to the car, Calvin threw the doggy out of the window and Percy pressed the gas pedal, but the car still wouldn't move. Upon checking, it was discovered that their tires were locked. After running quite a distance, Percy's legs suddenly cramped up. The two of them went into a convenience store to hide. Just then, a police patrol entered the store. Calvin, in a panic, hid the diamond in the bag of a neighboring woman. It turned out that the police weren't looking for them, and they panicked for nothing. Calvin and Percy were relieved, but on the other hand, they had lost the diamond because the woman had already left the store and gotten into her car. Calvin and Percy followed her in a cab. They arrived at the home of a married couple named Daryl and Vanessa. Calvin then climbs in the window of the house and overhears that Daryl and Vanessa have no children. Despite being married for quite some time, they desperately wanted a child to be a happy family. Well, they kind of wanted a baby. Percy suggests a plan. That plan is to disguise Calvin as a baby and drop him off at the doorstep of the house. Then they can retrieve the diamond from Vanessa's bag without arousing suspicion. Calvin agreed because he thought he would be able to get the diamond that night. Plan begins. Percy set up the crib outside Daryl's house, knocked on the door, and hurried away. Daryl opened the door and was surprised to see a little boy lying in front of the house. Daryl and his wife had brought the poor child into the house. They had no idea that the tiny infant was actually a grown man. Daryl and Vanessa wanted to take him to child services, but the office was closed over the weekend. Daryl and Vanessa then came up with the option of calling the police. At this point, the baby starts crying, which he has a hard time doing because of his severe coughing. So Daryl and Vanessa decide to take him to the doctor the next day. Daryl and Vanessa took Calvin to the doctor. Upon examination, it turned out that Calvin had many scars and a tattoo on his arm. The doctor then reported this to the authorities. The police arrived, trying to take Calvin away, but Calvin called Vanessa his mom and asked to be carried. Vanessa, who was desperate, finally took Calvin into her arms, determined to take care of him. At this time, Percy reports to Mr. Vacanam about the stone. Vacanam gives 24 hours for Percy to find the stone, thus saving himself the trouble. Calvin's presence arouses the suspicion of Vanessa's father, who also lives in Daryl's house. The father thinks Calvin is a bad person, but Calvin doesn't care. All that matters is that Daryl and Vanessa love him very much. Later, neighbors visited Daryl's house after hearing that the couple finally had a baby. Everyone was shocked to see Calvin's strange appearance. Upon seeing the baby, there was dead silence in the house. Then Calvin falls in love with Vanessa's sexy neighbor. Calvin begs to be carried in her arms and breastfed. The woman was annoyed by Calvin's funny antics, but then she handed Calvin over to a middle-aged woman who was known as the infant nurse at their apartment complex. After congratulating Daryl and his wife, the neighbors said their goodbyes.
Nursey? You want a nursey? Right.
It was bath time. Vanessa removes all of Calvin's clothes except for his diaper. The woman passionately kisses Calvin's tiny tummy and he was satisfied. Vanessa leads Calvin into the bathtub. He thought Vanessa was going to bathe him, but it turned out to be Daryl. After bathing and dressing, Daryl carried Calvin to the crib and put him to bed. Calvin planned to get the diamond while Daryl and Vanessa slept, but suddenly he fell asleep too. Calvin woke up to his own snoring in the middle of the night. He jumped out of bed and grabbed the diamond. The diamond was in his hands and Calvin was about to call Percy, but then he was caught red-handed by Vanessa's father and pointed a shotgun at Calvin's head. At the same time, Daryl showed up. He was surprised to see the actions of his father-in-law pointing the shotgun at the tiny baby. Daryl carries Calvin back to his room. The next morning, Vanessa turns on the television and forces Calvin to watch a children's show while she makes breakfast. Vanessa's father switched the television channel to a news program that reported a jewelry store robbery. Seeing himself on the news program, Calvin begins to fuss and capriciously demand that Vanessa switch back to the cartoon. Vanessa gives in to Calvin's whims and switches back to the cartoon. Calvin's wish is granted. Vanessa's father then reads the newspaper because now he can't watch the news on TV. Calvin then makes fun of the old man for making his plans difficult. Next, Vanessa is going to work and asks Daryl to feed the baby. Daryl was going to feed Calvin, but he has slightly different plans. He needs to solve the rock problem as quickly as possible, and so he knocks Daryl out. He picks up his bag and is about to leave when he suddenly notices Vanessa outside the house. It turns out that she forgot that very bag. Calvin moves the rock from Vanessa's bag to the baby bag in a hurry and sets Daryl down on the couch. Daryl then invites Calvin to play in the park. There, Calvin meets Percy, who asks for the diamond. Calvin tells him that the diamond was in one of the children's bags on a park bench. Perseus rushes to get it, but the mothers catch him in the act and yell at him. As Perseus tries to escape the mother's pursuit, Calvin steals Daryl's car and rushes down the street. Daryl panics, thinking Calvin is being kidnapped. He then stops a passing van and asks for help. They hit the gas, chasing Calvin, who was reckless in traffic. His car has a tire blowout, loses control, and crashes into a water barrel on the side of the road. Calvin immediately moved into the passenger seat as soon as the police arrived. Everyone thought Calvin had actually been kidnapped and the kidnapper had escaped. Elsewhere, Percy finally manages to steal a baby bag and bring it to Mr. Walken. They open the bag, but there is nothing interesting in the bag except dirty diapers. Mr. Walken's patience runs out and he lets Percy go in search of the stone. Another time, Daryl takes Calvin to watch a hockey game with a friend. Calvin tries to take the diamond out of his bag, but Daryl finds out about it. Calvin immediately puts the diamond in his mouth and swallows it so that the stone will fall into his stomach better. Calvin chugs it down with his neighbor's beer. The neighbor, of course, thinks Daryl did it, but he denies it and the neighbor buys more beer, which Calvin also drinks. Daryl and Calvin's story doesn't end there. However, as Calvin decides to throw a glass of beer at one of the players in the penalty area, and this leads to an altercation. Afterward, Daryl and Vanessa watch a sleeping Calvin in his bed. Seeing him sleeping peacefully, they both felt a wave of touching emotions. Daryl then took the initiative to throw a birthday party for Calvin because he was having a hard time because of the past few days. Vanessa welcomes Daryl's plan and thinks adoption is a good idea. The birthday celebrations have already begun. Daryl and Vanessa throw a birthday party for Calvin. They have fun at the party, and Calvin gets so caught up in the fun at the party that he forgets about his mission. Calvin even cried when Daryl and Vanessa brought him a birthday cake with candles. It just so happened to be Calvin's birthday. He was also very happy because for the first time in his life, he celebrated his birthday with great joy. After the party is over, Percy comes in and declares that he is Calvin's father and intends to take his son back. But Daryl kicked him out because he abandoned Calvin. The scene changes when Calvin sips a drink from the bottle. It turns out there was a laxative in the bottle and he immediately got a stomachache. Vanessa took Calvin to the restroom where she found the diamond that Calvin had swallowed and informed her husband. They then decided to celebrate the moment by having dinner outdoors. That night, Vanessa and Daryl leave, leaving Calvin to Vanessa's father. The old man gave a sly grin. Pops already knew that Calvin was a wanted diamond thief and tried to strangle him, but Vanessa and Daryl arrived just in time before Pops hurts Calvin. Pops repeatedly defends himself by saying that Calvin was hiding from the police, but Daryl and Vanessa don't believe him. Vanessa and Daryl conclude that Pops is out of his mind and decide to put him in a nursing home. Shortly afterward, Calvin finally manages to escape with the diamond. Upon seeing this fact, Daryl and Vanessa realize that what their dad said was true. Calvin had tricked them. Daryl calls the police and Vanessa picks up her dad. Percy was so happy that they finally got the diamond and Walken won't kill him. Percy then tells him that the plan worked out 100% and now the old movie thugs are going to Daryl's house because they think Daryl is Percy's partner and he ditched him and left the stone in him. Calvin scolds Percy because his stupidity will only sacrifice innocent people. Calvin then throws Percy out of the car and turns around, heading back to Daryl's house to rescue him. Once there, Walken threatens Daryl. Daryl says he has no idea what's going on and he's called the police and they should be there any minute. The people about the movie then took Calvin to his room. But thanks to Calvin's witty maneuvers, he finally manages to incapacitate all of Walken's men and hold him until the police arrive.
Okay, lay nicey.
Calvin then hands the diamond over to the police, and Daryl is very grateful to Calvin for deciding to come home to save his life. Calvin says goodbye to Daryl before he leaves and thanks him for taking care of him even though he is not a child. He tells him that he will be a good father one day. When Daryl left, Calvin started crying hysterically, realizing that he would miss Daryl and Vanessa who had been so good to him. Daryl then decides to let Calvin stay at his house and they become good friends.